This is the kind of moment that changes the temperature of an entire continent in a matter of hours. Ottawa moved. Washington reacted. Markets jolted. Boardrooms froze. Diplomats started making calls they were hoping they would never have to make. And suddenly, what was sold as a show of strength by Donald Trump is starting to look like something very different. A high-stakes economic war that hit a wall the moment Canada decided it was done absorbing the pressure and started firing back with force, precision, and unmistakable intent. Because this is not just about tariffs, or trade friction, or one more ugly headline in a noisy political cycle. This is bigger than that. Much bigger. What we are watching now is a power struggle disguised as an economic dispute. A test of leverage disguised as policy. A confrontation that reaches far beyond the border and straight into supply chains, energy security, industrial strategy, diplomatic credibility, and the basic question of whether the United States can use economic intimidation against a close ally without setting fire to its own machinery in the process. And right now, the answer is looking increasingly clear. Canada did not blink. Canada recalculated the battlefield. And Trump's economic war is starting to come apart fast. In this breakdown, I'm going to walk you through exactly what just happened, and why this response from Canada is far more aggressive and strategic than many people realize. I'm going to show you how the mechanics of this economic confrontation actually work beneath the slogans and the sound bites. I'm going to explain why the pain is not landing where Trump expected it to land, and why key sectors inside the United States are suddenly exposed. I'm going to reveal what is happening behind the scenes, from cabinet rooms to corporate panic to quiet diplomatic repositioning. I'm going to show you how the reaction from markets, industry, and allied capitals tells you everything you need to know about who really has leverage here. And I'm going to lay out what happens next, because if this escalates one more level, the consequences will not stay confined to trade. They will hit politics, prices, alliances, and power. And if you value sharp, serious breakdowns that go past the surface and get to the real strategic picture, subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is the part most people are still missing. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. So, let's get straight into it. The immediate event is this. Trump launched an economic attack designed to force compliance, project dominance, and put Canada on the defensive. The assumption behind that move was brutally simple. Canada sells heavily into the American market. Canada lives next to the United States. Canada depends on cross-border integration in autos, energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics. Therefore, if Washington turns economic pressure into a weapon, Ottawa will eventually have no choice but to soften, stall, negotiate from weakness, or split internally. That was the theory. Then reality arrived. Kenna's response was not symbolic. It was not hesitant. It was not the usual polished statement followed by a week of diplomatic caution. It was hard-edged, targeted, and strategic. Ottawa answered in a way that made one thing unmistakable. If Trump wants to turn economic interdependence into a weapon, Canada is prepared to prove that interdependence cuts both ways. That means retaliation where it hurts. That means countermeasures aimed at politically sensitive industries. That means pressure on sectors that are deeply connected to American employment, American exports, and American inflation. That means using not just tariffs, but procurement choices, regulatory timing, strategic signaling, and alliance coordination to turn Trump's war into a self-inflicted squeeze. And here's what this means. Trump did not pick a weak target. He picked a target that knows the US economy from the inside out. That is the first layer of this story, and already the stakes are enormous. But the deeper significance is even more explosive, because this is not Canada improvising under pressure. This looks like a government that understood exactly what was coming, mapped out the vulnerabilities, and decided that if a confrontation was going to happen, It would not be fought on Trump's preferred terrain of spectacle and bluff. It would be fought in the cold arithmetic of supply chains, contracts, exports, energy flows, and investor confidence. Think about how this unfolds in real time. Cameras capture statements at podiums. Headlines scream about retaliation. Politicians posture. But behind that theatre, something colder is happening. Trade lawyers are moving. Industry ministries are coordinating. Export data is being scrutinized. Major firms are rerouting assumptions. Agricultural groups are counting losses before they have fully materialized. Manufacturing executives are calling Washington, asking the same question in increasingly furious tones. Did anyone think this through? That is where economic wars are actually won or lost. Not in the first announcement, but in the second-order consequences. Not in the headline, but in the system shock that spreads behind it. And this is where the problem for Trump becomes severe. The US and Canadian economies are not simply connected. They are fused in strategic places. Cars are not built in one country and sold in another as if the process were clean and linear. Parts cross the border again and again. Energy is not a rhetorical prop. It is a daily reality. Industrial inputs do not care about political branding. Fertilizer, metals, timber, fuel, electricity, transport corridors, defense-adjacent manufacturing, food systems, even the psychology of regional commerce across border states and provinces. This is a tightly woven machine. You do not strike one side of that machine and walk away clean. And Canada knows that. Canada knows where the choke points are. Canada knows which American sectors are already fragile. Canada knows which governors will start making calls the minute jobs look threatened. Canada knows which industries cannot afford disruption even for a few weeks, because margins are thin, inventories are tighter than people realize, and political patience vanishes the second costs rise. Canada knows that if you squeeze certain inputs, delay certain approvals, redirect certain purchases, and harden certain positions, the pressure does not remain theoretical. It becomes immediate. It becomes visible. It becomes political. That is why this response matters so much. It is not a gesture. It is a message. If Trump wants escalation, Canada can make escalation expensive. And before I go further, if you're still watching, comment below with one word: leverage. Because that is the core of this entire showdown. Not noise, not slogans, leverage. And the next part is the most important part of the whole story. Let me walk you through the mechanics, because this is where the illusion starts to collapse. Trump's model of economic coercion depends on a familiar story. America is bigger. America can absorb more. America can absorb more pain. Therefore, America dictates the terms. That model can work against weaker, fragmented, or more isolated targets. But Canada is not that. Canada is embedded in the US economy in a way that makes punishment hard to localize. If Washington imposes broad pressure, Canadian retaliation does not need to match it dollar for dollar. It only needs to be smart enough to target the pressure points that multiply downstream damage inside the United States. That means industries with political sensitivity, regions with electoral value, inputs with no quick substitute, supply lines where delay becomes inflation, export markets where producers are already under strain, strategic materials that sound boring until they vanish from schedules and procurement plans. The beauty of Canada's position from Ottawa's perspective is that it does not need theatrical excess. It needs disciplined asymmetry. And that is exactly why this is starting to fall apart for Trump. Because the original premise of his economic war was dominance through shock. But if the target stays standing and starts redirecting the shock back into the attacker's own system, the performance of strength starts to look like strategic miscalculation. Watch the sequence, for the pressure campaign is announced as if it will force immediate submission. Then, Canada responds with retaliatory steps that are not emotional but calibrated. Then, business groups start warning of severe disruption. Then, markets begin pricing in volatility. Then, US consumers hear that prices may rise. Then, border state industries raise alarms. Then, political allies are forced to defend a strategy that is no longer producing fear abroad, but anxiety at home. Then, the language changes, quietly at first, not victory, not control. Suddenly, it becomes review, adjustment, talks, clarification, temporary dislocation. That shift tells you everything you need to know. The pattern is clear. When an economic war is working, the target is the one scrambling. When an economic war is failing, the initiator is the one trying to manage the fallout narrative. And behind the scenes, this is where it gets even more revealing. Because governments do not just react to the visible move, they react to what the visible move says about intent. Canada is not merely responding to a tariff line or a hostile statement. Canada is responding to a strategic doctrine. The idea that proximity equals vulnerability, that dependence equals obedience, that the larger power can always force concessions by creating pain faster than the smaller one can organize resistance. Ottawa's answer is devastating precisely because it rejects that doctrine outright. The answer is, we can organize faster than you think.
We can retaliate more intelligently than you expected. And most importantly, we can make you pay in places you did not want to fight. That changes everything. Because now, this is not just a Canada story. It is a signal to every ally, every trading partner, every capital watching Washington. If Canada can stand up under direct economic pressure and push back effectively, then Trump's broader coercive style loses part of its mystique. The aura of ineffability weakens. The threat becomes less clean, less one-directional, less terrifying. And once that happens, power starts leaking. That is what makes this moment historic. Now, let me give you 3 implications, because this is where the larger strategic meaning comes into focus. The first implication is domestic. Trump's economic war only works politically if Americans experience it as strength and foreigners experience it as fear. But if Americans experience it as higher costs, disrupted industry, nervous employers, and retaliatory pain aimed at politically important sectors, then the entire narrative begins to invert. Suddenly, the strong move looks reckless. Suddenly, the promised dominance looks like blowback. Suddenly, people who were told this would punish Canada start asking why their own prices are rising, why their own contracts are shaky, why their own supply chains are under strain. That is not just inconvenient, that is politically dangerous. The second implication is strategic. Canada's response demonstrates that allied interdependence is not passive, it can be weaponized in reverse. The United States is powerful, yes, but power inside an integrated system is more complicated than raw size. If a smaller partner occupies critical nodes, energy, materials, transport, industrial inputs, military adjacent supply, agricultural linkage, then the smaller partner can turn resilience into leverage, not because it is stronger overall, but because it understands the network. Canada is showing that you do not need to overpower the United States to frustrate an economic assault. You only need to force Washington to fight on terrain where every move carries domestic cost. The third implication is global. Other countries are watching this with extraordinary attention. They're asking a simple question. Can Trump-style economic pressure still dominate advanced partners the way it once appeared to? If the answer is no, if retaliation becomes credible, if coalition building becomes faster, if corporate America itself begins resisting the instability, then the coercive model starts to weaken beyond this one dispute. That does not mean American power disappears. Far from it. It means its application becomes riskier, more contested, and more vulnerable to strategic rebound. And that third implication may be the most important of all. Because once a tactic stops producing fear and starts producing resistance, it is no longer a tactic of control. It becomes a catalyst for counter-alignment. Now, let's talk about reactions, because reactions are often more revealing than the event itself. Inside Canada, this kind of response projects resolve. It tells the public that the government is not standing there observing punishment while hoping for better headlines tomorrow. It tells Canadian industry that Ottawa understands the stakes. It tells provincial leaders, exporters, unions, and business groups that there is a line, and that line has now been crossed. In moments like this, national posture matters. confidence matters, and the image of Canada calmly but forcefully hitting back carries political weight far beyond the details of any single measure. Inside the United States, the picture is much messier. Publicly, allies of Trump will frame the original move as necessary, bold, overdue, maybe even inevitable. But beneath that surface, the stress fractures widen. Companies that rely on cross-border stability do not care about ideological branding when contracts are at risk. Farmers do not celebrate retaliatory targeting when they are the ones getting hit. Manufacturers do not applaud strength when assembly lines slow down because parts are caught in a political firefight. Retailers do not cheer when prices rise. Governors do not enjoy explaining avoidable disruption. And investors do not reward chaos indefinitely just because it was packaged as leverage. That is the humiliating trap here. A war sold as proof of power is beginning to expose the limits of that power. And then there is the diplomatic layer. Allies hate unpredictability when it touches trade and strategic coordination at the same time. If Washington is willing to unleash economic force on Canada in a way that destabilizes a core bilateral relationship, then every allied capital starts recalculating its own exposure, quietly, methodically, sometimes invisibly. They diversify, they hedge, they talk more to each other, they trust a little less. That process does not make the evening news, but it matters. It matters because alliances are not just treaties and flags. They are habits of expectation, and when those habits break, rebuilding them is far harder than breaking them. So when we say Trump's economic war is falling apart fast, we are not talking about one dramatic reversal and a neat ending. We are talking about a chain reaction, a slow-motion collapse of assumptions. The assumption that Canada would fold, the assumption that retaliation could be contained, the assumption that domestic blowback would be manageable, the assumption that ally trust would survive anything, the assumption that power, once announced loudly enough, automatically becomes effective. No, not this time. What happened next is what always happens when strategy runs ahead of reality. The first costs are economic. The second costs are political. The third costs are reputational. And by the time those three layers overlap, leaders who thought they were cornering someone else start discovering how narrow their own options have become. Because what are the choices now? Escalate further, and you risk deepening the very domestic pain that is already undermining the strategy. Pull back too obviously, and you look weak after projecting maximal force. Seek negotiations, and you implicitly admit that the pressure campaign did not deliver the submission it promised. Try to save face with partial adjustments, and everyone sees the scramble. This is the no-win dynamic that emerges when coercion is launched without a clean off-ramp. Canada, meanwhile, gains something critically important: time and legitimacy. Time to harden alternative pathways, time to coordinate with partners, time to rally domestic consensus, time to let U.S. internal pressure build, and legitimacy, because retaliation against aggression is easier to defend publicly than aggression itself. That asymmetry matters. It matters in media framing, in diplomatic conversations, in market psychology, and in the public mind. And that tells you everything you need to know about who currently has the momentum. Now, none of this means Canada is immune. Let's be clear about that. Economic conflict with the United States is dangerous for Canada. It carries real costs, it creates real strain. It can hurt exporters, workers, and regions. But that is precisely why the response is so significant. Canada fired back anyway, not because the fight is painless, but because surrender would be even more costly in strategic terms. That is the logic of serious states under pressure. They do not ask whether resistance is free. They ask whether submission is survivable. That is the deeper story here. This is not a routine move, but a direct strategic message. Canada is saying if the relationship is going to be destabilized, the destabilization will not be one-sided. If coercion is the language coming from Washington, Ottawa will answer in the language of consequence.
If the goal was intimidation, the result has been mobilization. And now we get to what happens next. There are 3 plausible scenarios, and all of them are high stakes. In the first scenario, the pressure intensifies publicly, but privately, both sides hunt for an off-ramp. That would mean more tough rhetoric, more symbolic escalation, but also a behind-the-scenes attempt to contain the damage before markets, industries, and political constituencies force a broader retreat. In that scenario, Trump tries to preserve the image of strength while quietly reducing exposure. Canada keeps its posture hard until meaningful concessions appear. This is the most likely near-term path, when both sides understand the danger, but neither wants to be seen backing down first. In the second scenario, escalation outruns control. More sectors get pulled in. More retaliatory action lands. More industries begin lobbying. Consumer pain becomes visible. Regional political backlash grows. Diplomatic ties cool further. And what began as an economic confrontation starts bleeding into defense cooperation, energy planning, and broader alliance management. That is where the crisis stops being a trade fight and becomes something much more severe, a structural fracture between two countries that cannot afford one. In the third scenario, and this is the one Trump least wants, Canada's resistance works so effectively that the original campaign loses credibility altogether. Not overnight, not with a single admission, but through erosion, through confusion, through carve-outs, exceptions, legal challenges, tactical retreats, and narrative repositioning. In that scenario, the war does not end with a bang. It ends with the initiator pretending it was always about something smaller than it actually was. And if that is where this is going, then history will remember this moment very differently from the way it was advertised at launch. Because the core truth is brutally simple. Trump tried to turn economic pressure into a demonstration of power. Canada turned the same confrontation into a demonstration of limits. Limits of coercion, limits of bluster, limits of assuming that allies can be punished like subordinates without blowback, limits of treating integrated economies as if only one side has leverage. That is why the reaction has been so intense. That is why the mood shifted so quickly. That is why the language coming out of official channels already sounds more careful than it did at the start. Everyone involved can see the same thing now. The script did not hold. The intimidation did not land cleanly. The counterstrike was sharper than expected, and the battlefield is no longer controlled by the side that opened fire first. So as this story keeps moving, remember what you are really looking at. You are not just looking at a dispute. You are looking at a strategic exposure. You are looking at the moment when a pressure campaign designed to force obedience instead triggered resistance, backlash, and recalculation. You are looking at an economic war that was supposed to project dominance and instead started revealing fragility. Canada fired back hard. Hard enough to shift the balance, hard enough to rattle the assumptions, hard enough to force everyone watching, markets, ministries, CEOs, allies, voters, to confront a new reality. And that reality is devastating for Trump's strategy, because once the target stops acting like a target, the entire architecture of intimidation begins to collapse. Not slowly, fast, not quietly. Not as a policy disagreement, but as a strategic failure, unfolding in real time. And if this is the opening act, then the message to Washington is already unmistakable. Canada is not backing down. The costs are rising. The leverage is no longer one way. And the economic war that was supposed to break the other side is now breaking apart under the weight of its own miscalculation. That is the verdict. Canada didn't just respond. Canada changed the war, and Trump is now staring at the consequences.